Okay, so where we last left off on Friday, we talked about the fight throughout the intensification throughout the 1960s of the civil rights movement. First, to enforce, federal court orders about integration, whether that was at Ole Miss or interstate bus systems, and eventually getting the support of Kennedy and getting Kennedy to enforce those kinds of things, to send protections, marshals troops in certain situations. So he kind of gets dragged into that eventually. And then with the success of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the movement shifts specifically after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what kind of things specifically did they start to concentrate on after that? Voting rights. So then we saw demonstrations like the Selma to Montgomery March, which got public support and eventually, or also presidential support for what became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Eliminating literacy tests eventually. We see poll taxes eliminated, and giving the federal government essentially control, if necessary, over elections in states that had a history of discriminatory voting, all of the South, basically. At this point in 1965, we see the movement shift yet again. Now that they have achieved these two major legislative achievements, now we see a remarkable shift and a very noticeable shift in the civil rights movement as far as, in multiple ways, in what their overall goals were, the kind of things that they are now beginning to pursue, the kinds of discrimination, the kinds of rights that they are pursuing. All of that begins to change and become much more divided. The tactics that they're using starts to become much more different and divided. Leadership starts to fragment, and also the very location, proximity, where they were focusing their efforts and where different kinds of things were taking place start to shift after 1965. One of the first big events that kind of signifies this new direction, this kind of different direction, a different place for the African American civil rights movement were the Watts riots that happened in August of 1965, so not too long after the Voting Rights Act was passed. The Watts riots, these were a series of riots, basically, in what was called the Watts neighborhood. This is an African American neighborhood in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles area, where this was a very, it was an African American neighborhood, but quite a poor one, as a lot of African American neighborhoods in inner cities tended to be poverty stricken. They had been kind of left behind by the affluence of a lot of suburban areas and places like that in the wake of or after World War II. And so in protest of all sorts of things, of just their poverty, of the lack of investment, lack of resources, job discrimination, poor housing, any of those things, you see these riots pop up in the Watts neighborhood that lasted for days and days, and the whole neighborhood being torn up, and fires, and people getting hurt. There's looting, there are beatings, there are all kinds of violent events taking place in these riots. More than 30 people are killed in the Watts riots. Many businesses are destroyed. Other properties are destroyed. All of this, of course, people watching it on television at night. There's looting. There's ugly things on all fronts here. And this, not only did it lead to just riots in the Watts area, but that it also sparks other riots in other cities. Maybe not immediately. Some of those, take years, but over the next couple of years, there are multiple riots, race riots, and other riots in a lot of African American neighborhoods in lots of cities, from Chicago and Detroit. Over the next several years, there are hundreds. So many become quite concerned in the United States about the amount of what seems to be unrest and racial violence and all these sorts of things. The thing about the Watts riots, you notice this is remarkably different in a lot of ways than what we've been seeing. First of all, this is in California. This is in Los Angeles. Where has the civil rights movement been focused pretty much entirely up until now? It's been in the South. This is signifying that after 1965, it begins to move out of the South. It's not so much the South that is the area of concern, but urban areas in mostly the North. And that really makes sense, because as we talked about over the past several weeks and months, what had a lot of African Americans done as far as, go ahead. Yes, we know that since World War I in particular, we've seen a massive migration in multiple phases happen of African Americans out of the South. So actually, by this time, most African Americans were no longer in the South. I think about 70% of them had moved to the North and to the West. So it made sense that the movement would eventually shift there as well. And also, we talked about how after World War II, there was this move overall to the suburbs. But oftentimes, who was an exception to that? A lot of times African Americans are an exception to that. Those neighborhoods, those new suburb areas tended to be overwhelmingly white, either by de facto or legal segregation. So African Americans left in the cities, in urban areas that often become more and more poverty stricken because of white flight, because white families were leaving those areas and leaving them to blight, and leaving them to deteriorate and decay, and just kind of leaving it behind without another thought. And those were the kinds of things, and that kind of economic inequality is what a lot of the focus of the civil rights movement begins to focus on, because that's what the Watts riots and other kinds of protests there. It's not legal segregation that they're upset about, because there isn't any by that point, either because it was never there or it's already been outlawed. It's job discrimination. It is economic inequality. It is substandard housing. It is, the kinds of resources and the things that have, it's about economic position more than anything else. It is that, we're discriminated in other ways, not just separate facilities and lunch counters and all of that. But the movement at this point becomes much more fragmented. It starts to go off in a lot of different directions, and that can be quite problematic because it's not as unified from this point on. We're going to see a lot more splintering of people that want to kind of keep this strategy, and the people that are also going to be challenging the strategy that had seemed to work really, really well throughout the 1960s, the strategy of nonviolence and the strategy of unity and solidarity and cooperation with whites and so forth. That is about to change. There is a somewhat younger, more militant, perhaps more aggressive group that are starting to question that tactic and push for something a little bit different. So one of the ways that we see the African American civil rights movement splintering, fragmenting, changing after 1965 is one, the kind of, where it was focused, the kinds of rights they're talking about, and also the tactics and strategies. This is where we start to see the rise of what we call, known as the Black Power movement, that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, or sometimes it gets called Black nationalism or different things like that. The Black Power movement it's a much more militant phase of it. It's a much more aggressive phase. As you can imagine, that freaked out a lot of people. But their focus was more on sometimes, Black separatism. There is a emphasis on not cooperating with the white population and wanting to separate themselves from that, to say you can't trust the white population. We need to be sufficient on our own, that we need to have in the economic independence as well as political rights and all of those kind of things. So this becomes kind of the rallying cry for this oftentimes much younger, more militant. The people that would have embraced the Black Power movement have largely grown frustrated, have grown disillusioned with nonviolence, that feel like that has either not worked or it's not working fast enough, or see it as accommodating. It's too accommodating to white people. You're doing what the white people want you to do. And we need to do what is best for us and be more aggressive with it and not back down and not take no for an answer. There's more of an emphasis in the Black Power movement, far more, in racial pride. That's a big theme of the Black Power movement. Probably, people differed in it. There's degrees of everything. It's a spectrum to everything. But there's much more of an emphasis on cultural pride, racial pride, on getting people to be proud of and to learn more about, to flaunt their ethnic heritage, to embrace their African roots, whether that was in learning more about it, in the way that they dressed, in their hairstyles, in their names. A lot of people changing their names to names that were truly African, shedding, trying to adopt more of a Black identity and taking pride in that and being, much more culturally aware and celebrating those kinds of cultural differences. So many in the Black Power movement, as you can see, rejected this nonviolent approach. That doesn't necessarily mean they were all in favor of violence. Some of them might have been, but they definitely weren't always as opposed to it, and saw that, you know, turning the other cheek was not effective, and that they needed to be stronger, more militant, and all of that. Now, certainly, probably one of the most articulate voices to the more militant phase, to the Black Power movement, Black nationalism movement, that I'm sure a lot of you probably are thinking of, was, of course, Malcolm X, who sort of emerges as not only the most articulate voice, kind of the face of Black power, Black nationalism, but also as sort of the rival to Martin Luther King in a way, of course, is Malcolm X. Malcolm X, like I've already said, you know, personified, advocated all those things we were just talking about: Black separatism, non-cooperation with whites, at first at least. He does change throughout his career. Some of you that have, or his life, some of you know that if you've researched it and worked on Malcolm X. He doesn't always say that. But he had come to the conclusion, you know, that white Americans couldn't be trusted, and that African Americans needed to sort of pull themselves up, you know, become economically independent, and that they needed to fight more aggressively for those changes. So self-discipline, you know, pulling yourself up, self-respect, racial pride, and not cooperating, at least at first, with whites for all of those things. Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, we'll talk about this a little bit later, is eventually assassinated by Malcolm X was a part of, he represented the Nation of Islam, or Black Muslims, which is not the Islamic faith. It was another group that really doesn't have too much to do with the Islamic faith. It was more about it was almost kind of like a cult that was led by Elijah Muhammad, which is a very cult-like leader. And he eventually started breaking with the Nation of Islam, suggesting instead toward the end of his life that maybe there could be cooperation between African Americans and white Americans, and that maybe their violence wasn't the answer. And he started to promote ideas that were a bit more in line with King eventually. That led to tension and put him at odds with the Nation of Islam, and Malcolm X is assassinated by other rival members of the Nation of Islam that didn't like the kind of things he was saying. So even though at first he did reject King's message of nonviolence, and at first he did reject, you know, the cooperation with rights and all of those, he eventually does start, he was just beginning, I mean, he was just starting around that corner a little bit and changed his mind about that when he is assassinated. But nevertheless, remains kind of certainly a physical symbol, visual symbol of that much more, you know, militant phase of the civil rights movement. Another example, or another group that personifies this much more militant attitude, quite literally in their case, of the African American civil rights movement, is the Black Panthers, so the Black Panther Party, you may have heard. The Black Panthers were, you know, trying to encourage political activism, trying to run candidates for office, encourage people of certain beliefs to run for office, to vote for their candidates, you know, that ran on platforms that promoted Black nationalism and they promoted policies that they believed empowered African Americans, some of which were considered quite radical and very extremely militant, as you can see. And they adopted, even though it is mostly for show, you can see how they adopted intentionally a very militant style. What do you notice? These are some Black Panthers here. What do you notice about the way they are dressed? They have like military uniforms on, military berets. They openly carry weapons. So while they were not, you know, they get branded oftentimes as like a vigilante militia group kind of running around killing folks. That's not really the case. A lot of that was symbolic, but they did do it, and they did advocate that others needed to, you know, openly carry weapons, defend yourself, and be ready to fight back. Don't turn the other cheek. Fight back if, you know, if something happens or there's discrimination or things like that. So you can see how that freaked out lots of people, particularly a lot of white people. And as the movement fragments like this and starts to divide like this, it does alienate a lot of white activists. Before this, groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is a specific example, that started out as a cooperative group committed to nonviolence. You had African American activists and a white activist in that group. It takes a radical turn at this point. SNCC becomes committed more to Black nationalism, to Black separatism. They kick out all the white members, and they are just kind of kicked to the curb. And again, that really alienates and causes a lot of conflict in the movement as well. So things can get a little bit confused at this point, and some people kind of feeling wronged by it. You can see how you have a lot of folks that supported, things and were involved in certain groups and then felt kind of kicked out and pushed to the side after all of that. So it becomes much different at this point. So the movement after 1965 becomes, it moves out of the South, it moves to the North, it moves into the cities. It starts to look more at economic situations, at the lack of good education, the lack of good paying jobs, just simple job discrimination, and the overall cycle of poverty, and arguing that, systematic racism for centuries and centuries had prevented African Americans from doing better, had prevented them from getting out of poverty, and that those systematic blocks were still there. And they are protesting a lot of those things in a lot of very different ways. So the movement, of course, and I think so often the story gets told as if, Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of 1965 happened, and then it's all over and done with, and it's finished, we move on. Which, of course, we've certainly seen, in the past 12 months that that's not the case. Absolutely. So the movement does continue, but it's a bit more difficult to track in a linear little line, like we're able to do, from 1955 on. It's easy to kind of put it all in a little timeline like that. That's harder to do after 1965 because it does start to splinter and divide. But of course, things continue. Also, by 1965, there are other things going on that further complicate the whole national conversation, because you're starting to see by this point increasing tension and increasing protest over Vietnam and other kinds of social unrest that is happening in the wake of Vietnam, as well as just people, rejecting that whole conformist culture of the 1950s. There's just a major social upheaval that is related partially to civil rights, but also to other things that's going on by the late 1960s as well. So that's another reason why the civil rights movement kind of becomes a little bit less unified and a little bit less articulated, because there's so many other things that were kind of hogging the spotlight, as it were, by that point. And also a lot of folks became, like I said, alienated with it, a little disillusioned by it, particularly as it takes a more violent kind of a phase. So we'll continue to see things related to it, and later this week we will look at some of those other issues over Vietnam and so forth, as we'll be looking at tomorrow. So any questions on that much? Okay. Maybe.